Today, I'm joined by the wonderful and talented Eliza Jiménez Cossio. So thank you so much for coming up to Santa Barbara for us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes. So let's get started with your life pre Our Flag Means Death.
Sure.
How did you come to be involved with the show? What were you doing, and how did you end up here?
So I've come up through the comedy scene in New York, and I came up through New York late night shows. I started at The Daily Show with Jon Stewart a million years ago as like an intern PA, and then I ended up leaving The Daily Show sometime after Trevor was on to really focus on writing, because I only ever saw myself as a performer. I only wanted to be a performer, and in doing that, I became a good writer because I was trying to write more to perform. And so from there, I transitioned out of late night into narrative stuff, and I did One Day at a Time. And then after One Day at a Time, one of the writers, Bridget Munoz-Leibowitz, who created Gordita Chronicles on HBO Max, had worked with David on People of Earth. And David had asked her if she knew anybody who's written a weird script. And I wrote a Sopranos Sex and the City crossover script that got me all my jobs, truly. And so she sent him that, and that's how I got on David's radar, and I'm like forever grateful for that connection.
Well, now that you mentioned it, could you maybe talk a little bit about that crossover then between
Absolutely.
Sex and the City and The Sopranos? When can we see it?
Well, that's a dream. I am a little afraid it's my Citizen Kane and that it's the best thing I'll ever do, but no, writing is regenerative and creativity is always in you. I say to myself all the time, and it's true. I'm a huge Sopranos fan. It's like the most important television show for me, and I of course just love Sex and the City. And I think I was doing a rewatch of Sex and the City, and they mentioned New Jersey or something, and I was like, oh yeah, they're like right across the river from The Sopranos, and they aired at the same time. So like crossovers of like the 90s, I feel like growing up, we had like Boy Meets World and like step-by-step crossovers and stuff, if that means anything to anybody. I just tweeted something like, why was this never a thing? And then I immediately deleted it because I was like, oh, I have to make that a thing. And so then I wrote it, and then I put it out on my Twitter, and it got like semi-viral and got me attention, so yeah. Yeah.
No, well, I feel like in a lot of ways that kind of sets the stage in a certain way for your work on Our Flag Means Death, that kind of almost irreverent mixing of genres or traditions together. And so I wonder, could you maybe talk about, like, as you were writing either the fourth episode, the one that we watched today, or other writing for the show, how do you think about, say, genre and traditions, and how do you kind of mix highbrow, lowbrow, or how do you kind of like bring these dispersed elements together in your writing?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's like a question I'm always asking, and I'm always finding different answers to. And I take so much influence from drama series, and even in while I was writing this, I feel like I was thinking a lot and rewatching a lot of Sopranos episodes, a lot of Mad Men, and especially for like dream sequence hallucination stuff. For Sopranos, for me was pretty big. But I always think of it as simple as like I like dramas that have comedy and comedy that has drama, and somebody who's in a comedy shouldn't know they're in a comedy. They should be treating this with the same stakes and I think you see Rhys Darby, who plays Steve Bonnet, do it so well. He really is like fighting for his life out there, and it's funny for us to watch because of the context. But yeah, I guess I really gravitate towards things that feel real, but a lot of real stuff is funny, so I feel like it kind of blends, but it is always, it's a fine line, and it's always kind of moving and changing depending on what you're working on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when you were approached to work on Our Flag Means Death, then what attracted to you about the show, and what was most kind of original or enticing for you to work on an opportunity like this?
I read this script, and I immediately was like, this is so good. And I think it was when he takes the plant from the like fisherman, and there was dialogue there that has gotten cut, but I remember there was a line where the fisherman was like, "It's me plant, sir." And I just was like, this is so funny. So it just felt so fresh and fun and also familiar, like with, kind of has some like office-y Parks and Recs vibes to it. So yeah.
Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned Office and Parks and Rec and all that, because, as I was watching, inhaling the show, really, like, I was thinking a lot about, it feels, on the one hand, so unique and fresh and distinct from a lot of, what you traditionally think of when you think of pirates on television, things like that. But on the other hand, I was thinking, well, actually, no, it feels quite similar in a lot of ways. It kind of comes from that era for me of, The Office, Parks and Rec, that type of tradition. And so I wonder, like, as you were working on the show, were there other television shows or films that you were looking to and thinking about when writing this, and how did they influence your writing?
Yeah, well, those shows like Office and Parks and Rec are so like, in my veins at this point that those just kind of are kind of always top of mind in some way, or at least at the surface. But yeah, as I said, I kind of would draw from dramas and rom-coms a lot. I sort of became like the rom-com person in the writer's room, and like people would like ask me about all these different rom-com tropes and things. And so I remember really thinking about like Roman Holiday, which is my favorite movie, and Notting Hill, in terms of like, in those it's like a celebrity or a princess and a regular guy, and in this it's like Blackbeard and like a regular guy pirate. But yeah, I find so much like joy from rom-coms and meet cutes, and that's why I was so like flattered that David asked me to write this episode, because it's the meet cute, and I really, really thrive on that. I basically love writing characters when they fall in love and when they fall out of love, and so it's fun to write them fall in love.
Well, and in a certain way, in the fourth episode, too, you get a little bit of both, right? Between Sia and his wife as well, kind of arguably falling.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Great performance, Claudia Doherty. She's so good. Yeah. Was there another part of this question that I missed?
Well, no, now I'm just thinking about, like, Audrey Hepburn as Blackbeard. So I don't know, like, now that you mentioned Roman Holiday, that's... So, I don't know if you've started on season 3 yet, but, I'll just plant that seed for you right there. Well, I guess on that irreverent note, could you maybe talk about, the show is based on a real-life historical figure, right, Steve Bennett. Could you maybe talk about how did you think about your relationship to history with a capital H when writing the show? Like were you and the other writers really committed to, okay, we have to get the details right. We want it to seem very historically accurate, whatever that means. Or were you given kind of carte blanche to go wherever you wanted to in terms of the show?
Yeah, David was, I think from the top he had said, and I'm talking about David Jenkins, the creator and showrunner, he was very clear, like, we don't have to stick to history here. I think he even said, like, you don't have to read anything. But I'm like a student, so I was like, I'm gonna read, whatever I can. And we did have some films to watch. We watched Master and Commander and The Lighthouse, although that's more like creatively inspiring. But historically speaking, there was a writer in the room named Saide, who was like an encyclopedia, and they just knew like everything about this time period. And so sometimes they would just come up with a fact that we all were like, how do you know that? And then it would turn into something. So they had a really great role in the room, aside from being a great writer, that they would bring some of these stories to light. And one of the things that I read was the general history of the pirates, which is written, I think, in like 1780 or so, and it was written by this person who said they were a pirate captain, but it's written in a way that's very like, attention grab. It's really like, we don't know if it's really true stories, it just sounds like fun stories. And in that book is like some of the more popular ideas of who Blackbeard is, and stories about like Mary Read and Anne Bonny and Calico Jack and stuff. So there was just like, it was kind of there at the surface, but we never felt like we had to stick to anything. But I remember in my interview with David, he had said, this story about Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard. In real life, what happens is they like found each other, they started sailing with each other for a while, they're over, and then they died. And he was like, the only way I can see somebody like Blackbeard hanging out with like this bad pirate that everybody is like making fun of is if they fell in love. And I was like, that's so good. That's great. Yeah.
Was there anything left on the cutting room floor? Like anything like that you like wanted really hard to get into the first season, or it had to be scrapped, or it's something you didn't have the time for? Either like a historical detail or character that you were interested in, or a joke that was too crass for HBO Max, or was there something that didn't make the cut that you like still feel guilty about or sad about?
A lot of stuff made it in. David is really. He comes from playwriting, and he's very detail-oriented, and I pretty much a lot of the, at least in terms of like what was on the script, ended up for the most part on screen. I did just reread my last version of episode 4, which after I write my final version, I do edits on my version, and then the showrunner takes like their edits on it. My last version, I had a running joke where Blackbeard just kept saying, "Oh, I love that." And it's so small, but I really liked it. But it didn't make the cut.
Justice.
Yeah.
If you could maybe walk us through then the process of what was an average writing session like for the show? Like how did it go from maybe a germ of an idea for, this could become an episode down the line, to working in maybe a writer's room or a kind of collaborative environment, to what we just saw right there? Like could you walk us through like what it was like to write for the show?
David and Taika Waititi created it together and pitched it together and sold it. And David, in that process, what happens a lot of time when you're pitching is you come up with a Bible for the whole season. And so that's like episode by episode, what would happen. You come up with a season arc, all the characters. So by the time, this show was sold and they're hiring writers and I'm brought into it, I have this whole Bible of what every episode will look like. And so we go into the room with that, but then it's still like the first few days of a writer's room, it's still like what we call like blue sky territory. So we just kind of blue sky ideas, which means you could kind of throw out any idea. And, sometimes stuff comes from that. Sometimes stuff comes from like a conversation. Sometimes stuff comes from a joke and it turns into a story or an episode idea. But it generally stayed pretty, it definitely had the same arc that David had initially lined up, but there was certainly like variation and changes in the exact episodes. Yeah, and then when we're working on one episode, everybody's kind of outlining it together that's kind of the easiest way to explain it. We're kind of like, this was a Zoom room, so if it were in person, we'd have like a whiteboard or like index cards and be like moving things around. On Zoom, we used a program that I can't remember, but it's like basically that online. And then we outline it together, and then the writer who was going to write that episode does like a more detailed outline of that, and that gets approved by people above me and who I don't know really, and then obviously approved by David, and then the writer goes off on script and then gets edits and kind of back and forth until production.
And then speaking of production then, were you involved at all in, say, the filming of the episode, and how, if you were, like, did you notice anything about, is there a lot of space for improvisation when filming the show? Like, how much of what you wrote made it to the screen? Was there anything that was maybe ad-libbed on set? Anything like that?
Yeah, well, a few things to this question. One, in terms of the ad-lib, I remember David saying that, like, because a lot of times if you're writing a comedy, you'll come up with what are called alts for jokes. So it's really just alternative jokes to something, and you're just kind of trying to come up with the best joke. And I remember, and we didn't really do that for this show because David was like, Taika's the alt, because Taika likes to have fun on set. And actually, a really important moment for the season that Taika improvised is the foot touch in 8 or 9 when they're like locked up by the Spanish and the chain by Fleetwood Mac is playing, and then Taika reaches his foot over to Reese and Blackbeard to Steed. I don't need to use the actors' names. Everybody knows who they are. And that was Taika. Taika just did that. That wasn't in the script. So that's the answer to improv. And also I think Joel Fry, who plays Frenchie, he wrote all those songs, and like those weren't in the script. He just kind of like came up with them. Yeah. But if I was on set, I was not on set. I went to visit set for a day, but the way things are on sets now is writers don't get to go on set when they have their episode, which historically they have been, and it's a cool experience, supposedly, because you're on set and you can like help with alts and help with whatever, and but that's one of the things that like the Writers Guild in the strike right now is trying to get allow us to get paid for being able to actually do that and get the experience of being writing producers, because it is a really great skill to have and leads to other possible things. And I know for me personally, I'm also a director, so I feel like I would do well on set, but I haven't unfortunately been able to do it.
No. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that Taika Waititi, I think he's going to go somewhere.
I think
someday.
so too.
Sounds quite talented. So I was also thinking, rewatching these episodes today, I was thinking in my head, going through the Rolodex of, okay, these are other things I've seen involving pirates or people at sea, things like that. And by and large, like Master and Commander, for instance, like heavy on action, heavy on drama, intrigue, all of that stuff, but they aren't terribly funny most of the time. Like there's maybe like a joke interwoven in, Pirates of the Caribbean or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I'm just so curious to hear more about maybe how you understand maybe the relationship between, say, humor and comedy and piracy or going to sea, right? Because it seems like a lot of the kind of things you encounter in the 18th century on the ocean lend themselves to jokes, weirdly enough. It's a ludicrous environment.
Yeah.
It's very funny. There's like gallows humor to be had. Could you maybe talk about, like, as a writer, what became funny for you writing for the show? Like, how could you kind of use a space that I think isn't often thought of in comedic terms and turn that into a kind of dark humor or like even satire?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is that it really, the comedy comes from character. And this might be, I didn't study playwriting, and I also didn't study TV writing, so what do I really know? But playwriting, from what I understand, and from what I have read on it, is it's like a lot of prestige drama right now seems to stem from like playwriting theory in terms of like character is the center that should drive everything. And I think that either because David comes from playwriting or because he just was able to create a writer's room with similar sensibilities, we were all kind of thinking like, this character is what's insane in this environment, and this character who really just is looking for something, and it really, we've all been looking for something, and we've all been ridiculous as we've looked for something before, and I think that that's what drives up the comedy so much, in addition to like you were saying, the context of like, it really is a mishmash of a lot of people on pirate ships and always has been, and like everybody falls in love and everybody hooks up and sounds great. But like I think Steed's character, and then also really fortifying the other characters that we're on, is what kind of allows it to be such a like fertile playground for jokes and comedy.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed since the show's been out and so widely consumed and enjoyed and appreciated by fans is that it has resonated for so many different kind of communities, either in North America or across the world. And so, I mean, I don't know if you have any sense as to why that is, or like if you have any kind of speculations about why this show has kind of found this almost underground audience at a time where I feel like we're kind of like oversaturated with new content on HBO Max. It seems like shows like this are hard to come by and yet like avidly consumed by fans. Like, do you have any idea like why that might be, or why you think people are so compelled by the show?
Yeah, I think I've thought about this, and what I also really like about it is it's it's queer characters who are just kind of existing, and it's not a show about specifically being queer, but like it kind of just allows these different types of people to exist, and it allows us to see how they have been existing for so long, but maybe just without the language we know of now, or things like that. So I think to me that's what's nice, is it's there's certainly and always will be a place for art that is like very identity based, and that's paved the way in so many ways, for for Latinx shows and everything, and for queer shows. But I think what's also exciting is being able to be in this space now, thanks to those types of shows and art, where you could just kind of be these characters existing. And I think that's it, but that's just one sense I have about it.
Yeah. No, and I hope this was intentional, but I was noticing in the second episode we watched for today, there's such a kind of delightful gag where they're in the auxiliary wardrobe, right? And they're literally trapped in the closet at this moment, right? And I thought that was such a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of joke right there. But I wonder, as a writer then, if you don't have the vocabulary or the language to be like, I am homosexual, or I am gay, or I am queer, or whatever, those words barely existed in the 18th century, as it were. Can you use double entendres, or can you turn that into another source of kind of wordplay or suggestive dialogue, where in other words, what you're doing here is you're conveying a character's sexual orientation or identity or character, not through verbal communication or dialogue, but through other ways of getting it across to the audience that hey, Stede Bonnet is very unhappily married to a woman. Maybe he's gay, who knows? How do you kind of convey that then as a writer, absent this kind of vocabulary for homosexuality or queerness?
Yeah, I guess it's it is also kind of a general writing, tentpole that I try to do is never hit anything on the nose. And so in some ways it's an extension of that. But I guess, I like leaving space for exactly what's going on. I like thinking about Stede as potentially bisexual or as potentially gay, but I also kind of like that I don't really have to. All I think about is I want him and Blackbeard to get together, And so I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I guess it's leaving space so that it can kind of allow the characters to just be focusing on the love and not the identity, so that, I don't know, there's something to me that can be a little more freeing about that.
No, absolutely. And I was also thinking about, when you were mentioning identity, I was thinking about especially the supporting cast, or the so-called supporting cast of the show, right? Because it is an ensemble piece in a lot of ways, right? I'm thinking about actors like Viggo Ortiz, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And so when you were working in, say, the writer's room, how intentional or deliberate were you in saying, okay, we want to aim for this type of ensemble, we want to aim for this type of cast? Because again, in my experience, most pirate television shows and movies are pretty white, right? Usually white guys from Europe going across and trying to, set sail on the seven seas. So how did you kind of incorporate then a question of, say, especially racial and ethnic identity into writing, this grand ensemble aboard the ship?
Well, and again, credit to David, he was really, really great at making a diverse room, and so there were a lot of non-binary folks. There were a lot of us somewhere on the queer spectrum, and then there were a lot of people of color, and I think there was a sense too about pirate ships. Historically, would be kind of a lot of different types of people, and I remember Saide, the writer who was the encyclopedia, saying that there are some historians who think Blackbeard might have been black or indigenous because he was always freeing slaves. So I think it's kind of there are these stories that exist already but aren't as well known, aren't as well portrayed, and so they just happen to be portrayed here, but they weren't completely unheard of. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, when you were brought on to work with the show, were you aware that it would be eventually airing on HBO, or I guess now it's just Max, but
Right.
HBO Max, like did the kind of venue for this type of show influence at all what you could get away with in the show? Like were you saying like, oh, if we aren't writing for Peacock or ABC or CBS or whatever, can we push the envelope a little bit more maybe with HBO Max in terms of these exact issues? Like do you feel like you were, how much did HBO's HBO-ness factor into your writing for the show?
Yeah, I did not think about that at all, but not, I guess in that I knew it was going to be, I was thinking about it as an HBO show, so I know it would have been different if it was a show on ABC, but I kind of just, I kind of, in my mind, have divided it as like a streaming vibe and a network vibe, so I don't think that really played too much for me personally, but once the show is sold and the studio bought it, they're in for the vibe, and so I kind of just have to trust that my boss hired me for a good reason, and that I'm, my job is to make his job easier. So I think I'm pitching in a way that he likes, and in a way that ultimately, hopefully, the studio will like.
Yeah, well, could you go back to that divide between I think you referred to it as a network vibe and a streaming vibe? What does that mean to you? And how does that maybe materialize in your writing? How does it, have you written for both? And what are the differences between them?
I have only written for streaming actually, but it's not exactly like this. It was like this, I think, when I started getting into narrative, where streaming was a little edgier or funkier, and network was more what we kind of historically think of as sitcom-y or procedurally drama-y things. But obviously, streaming has expanded exponentially, and again, to bring the writers' strike into this, it's expanded so much while writers' pay is going down, and it's not just writers, it's everybody in the industry, and I'm so grateful to be in a union that's so organized that can make movement on this. But yeah, it's kind of a very clear story of money being made at the top, and more and more money, and wanting to spend less and less money. A very gilded age. Yeah.
Coming soon to HBO Max.
Yeah.
Well, I guess also on that note then, again, to use your terminology, you just referred to streaming vibes as funkier in a certain way, right? And so I wonder if you could maybe talk, I know we only watched 2 out of, I believe, the 10 episodes of the first season today, but could you maybe talk about elsewhere, maybe in other episodes we didn't screen for today, what does that funkiness mean for you? Or how involved were you with other episodes in the show? And how did it, being originally written and conceived for a streaming platform then, inspire you to take maybe creative risks elsewhere in the show?
Well, yeah, so in a writer's room, it's actually quite inaccurate to say I wrote episode 4, because truly we all outline together, and a lot of it comes from so many different places, and I just happen to be the name on it that's meshing it all together. And so I feel that's I like to say that to newer writers or to people who are entering writers' rooms, because it can be easy to kind of, you want to leave ego at the door in a writer's room, and it really is wherever the joke comes from, you never count how many jokes you get in a script. It could ruin your life. But so in that sense, I was, because we are all outlining pretty much every episode together, I was involved in all the episodes, and all the funkier stuff. I mean, I really liked how important music was to David, and he wrote in the songs into the scripts. I think The Chain was written into the script. I think Cat Stevens was written into the script, and I not that music is inherently funky, but I liked that kind of helped make the tone like still have this softness, this like this sweetness that I think Taika also, you know, does really well, while it's still being like a bunch of weird people trapped in a room together, essentially. A family that's stuck together is basically what this show is.
Yeah. No, and that's such a beautiful way of putting it, right? Because I was thinking, like, there is a surprising sweetness to the show, even though, like, in the first episodes, a man is literally, like, impaled with a sword right through his head. So that brings me to my next question, which is begins with a quote. So this was for a piece called Collider Online, and Danny Hurd writes, and I quote, David Jenkins' pirate rom-com series, Our Flag Means Death, isn't just a great example of queer representation, but a great example of queer joy. And so it's funny, because I think you just mentioned, you know, sweetness and the kind of fondness, I think, that, you know, everybody aboard the ship has for one another. And in the quotation I just read, you know, they refer to queer joy. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk about, to me, what seemed to be kind of these extreme ends of, say, queer joy or tenderness or sweetness on one hand, and then, you know, F-bombs galore, people dying or getting mutilated or losing limbs, you know, like everything that comes with going to sea in the 18th century. And how do you see these two kind of extremes working together in the show? Because I think, like, you can actually play them off of one another in a really interesting way. And I think that, like, for me, part of what's so exciting about the show is that, you know, you never know if something is going to lead to, like, a punchline or someone getting, like, dismembered. And sometimes it'll be both, right? So, like, maybe as a writer, how does, you know, what this one critic call queer joy, how does that maybe intersect with you with, like, the gruesome, grisly, violent nature of being a pirate?
I mean, it's kind of like the same way life is just, like, weird and funny and sweet sometimes, and then you turn around and it could be, like, really a punch in the gut. And it just happens to be that these characters, their version of being punched in the gut is, like, literally, you know, getting stabbed in the gut, you know. And so, like, I think it's like the context of the environment for these characters is that kind of swashbuckling stuff that you're talking about. But then they are also queer characters who are finding joy. And that's, again, I feel like that's like a life thing, is like, you know, we find joy even when things are really bad, or when things are really weird, or when things are really good, but it's not obviously all the same time. And as Oprah Winfrey says, joy is not the same thing as happiness. So joy can come in, you know, it doesn't have to be consistent. And I think that that's what I see as, like, what these characters are experiencing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and I guess to shift gears ever so slightly, you know, I was also thinking, I mentioned the ensemble cast a little bit ago, but of course the first season especially is known for its guest stars. In virtually every episode there's a cameo or a guest star, or things like that. And so did you know any of that going into when you started working on the show? Like, oh, we'll have Fred Armisen, for instance, or Will Arnett. Like, we know, like, this person will be in this episode. We don't know what role they'll be playing. Or, like, could you just say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could get Will Arnett for this show? Like, how did that go about?
It's such fun information in any writer's room when you find out who your guest star is for certain things. And so, you know, sometimes we would just, like, talk about who we would like in this type of role. And I think Will Arnett might have been circling around for Calico Jack for a little bit between us in the room, but I can't quite remember. But once we found out, it was just so exciting to have him. And the one day I was on set visiting, he was on set, and he is so fun to watch. And he does improvise a lot. And actually, yeah, a lot of his lines are improvised. And he's talking about people, like, burning in the ship, and he's so good. But yeah, and the weird thing about writing a season 1 of a show is you are writing before you know who's cast on the main roles, and so it's just interesting to be doing that and then be like, oh, we did get Taika. So I guess we're writing Blackbeard as Taika. And oh my gosh, a thing I loved that David said was that this is Blackbeard on this show is Sofia Coppola's Blackbeard. It's not like Blackbeard as we know him, and I love that.
So I believe right now we will now turn it over to the audience. So we can't really see, but we're going to be assisted. So if you have a question for Eliza, please raise your hand, and I believe Tyler will pass out a microphone.
Yeah. So you have. Hi. On IMDb, you're listed as both a writer for an episode, and clearly part of the writer's room, but also as an executive story editor. Can you talk about the difference between those roles?
Yeah, I can. It's kind of. So when you are a writer, you have to have a certain title in the room, and it's kind of just the way the WGA works. It really just means like it means what your experience is, but it also means what your minimum payment has to be. And so usually you start as a staff writer, and when you're a staff writer, again, as it is now, and what the WGA is fighting against is when you're a staff writer, you don't get paid for an episode, which, normally, you get paid for your work. And then from above there, you start kind of moving up. And then when you have representatives, agents, or managers, they help kind of negotiate what your position will be in the next room. And so it's with mini rooms, which again, another thing WGA is fighting against, which mini rooms are essentially rooms that are smaller in size and or in number, but studios want the same amount of work done from them. It becomes harder to kind of move up in ranks because you kind of stay at, it's easy to get stuck in like similar places because you're in smaller rooms that go for a shorter amount of time. So generally the levels up are something like staff writer, story editor, executive story editor. I'm not sure exactly what it goes, but it goes up to like co-producer, co-executive producer, and there might be things in between that I'm not really sure of. But on IMDb, I think it might just say writer because I literally wrote an episode, and then my role is technically for season 1 was executive story editor.
Hi. So you talked about the kind of incidental queerness of the characters, but something that I really loved about the show is that it's still a romance. Like, it's not just smush the queer characters together because they're both queer. Like, they are visibly falling in love, and they have this like romantic and sexual tension. Could you talk about writing that element of it?
Like sexual tension for queerness?
Sure. Well, between the two of them, between like obviously Rhys Darby and Taika Waititi have like awesome chemistry between them anyway, but it's still a love story, right?
Yeah.
They are still.
Well, it is kind of funny. Sometimes I like miss information and I forget something, and so I went into the writer's room thinking we were just mapping a friendship on a romance. So I remember thinking like, okay, this is a friendship until a certain point, and there were a couple of us where we were like, oh, we're gonna make them kiss, and this is not just a friendship. And so I think it's kind of funny how for me it was kind of similar to how I think it might be for a viewer watching it, be like, oh, this is happening. But I think that's what, I mean, like I said, I'm such a rom-com head, and so I just found so much fun in finding these two characters who are feeling out of place, feeling at the end of something, but they don't know what's next, and then having some kind of magnet that brings them together. And even like rewatching 1 and seeing the way like Taika's looking at Rhys and the way he like touches his hand when he comes out of the fever, I like that a lot of those things were always there. And I like bringing them like more to the forefront as we go through the season.
Hi. First off, congratulations on writing something that's absolutely brilliant.
That's so nice.
I'm wondering, there are so many other side plots of romance between certain sets of characters. I'm wondering if that was something that was pre-planned and predetermined, or something that just naturally occurred from the way the script was developing.
I remember Jim and Olu being a thing from the beginning, but I don't think we knew how we were going to end them for the season. And then Blackbeard and Lucius, I think they were also a thing from early on at least, but I think, again, we weren't sure how to end them for the season. And, you know, when you have 3 new relationships on a show, it's actually kind of hard to like make sure they're all like different in their own way and, you know, are in different stages of whatever their relationship is. So I think the answer is like a lot of it was there, but we just weren't sure like exactly how it would turn out until we were going through it.
Every character goes through usually some pretty significant trauma, and that as they kind of come together as a community, like how conscious are you of the fact that they're working through those things and how they trigger certain things or heal certain things?
For each individual character, like what their traumas are?
Yeah.
Well, I'm always thinking about my trauma and everything I do. So I guess that is something that is something that I think about a lot, in that I think of myself, when I think of myself as a writer, I think of myself as an armchair psychologist for a bunch of people that I don't know, who are my characters. And I'm trying to be, I'm genuinely like, I'm truly thinking about just psychology at some level when I'm thinking about what to do with them or how they would react, how they would respond to things. And I wish I could pull an example off the top of mind, but you know, like when Jim goes back to their home, that was certainly, you know, I remember at the time being like, how are we going to handle them like going back to this place where, you know, basically the opening from, what is that Tarantino movie? Hateful Eight? No. What's the open where like everybody dies? What's that Tarantino movie where everyone dies?
Is it Inglourious Basterds?
Inglourious Basterds. Thank you. Like Jim basically had that happen. And so I think that is always something I'm thinking about, like how do we keep these characters like real breathing human beings who've been through, but also, you know, have them exist in a comedy.
So you a couple of minutes ago were talking about the scene where Blackbeard sees himself in the book and is kind of shocked and somewhat horrified by kind of the public perception of him. Was that something that you came up with, or is that something that the writers' room together came up with, or is that just Taika just being Taika?
I think that came together in the room. I remember I wrote a joke into the script, which was that Steed had an entire shelf of Blackbeard books, labeled Blackbeard books, but that did not make it. But I'm pretty sure that was everybody, and it could have even just come straight from David in terms of like, because that's what we wanted in terms of like, Steed did not like living up to who people expected him to be, and Blackbeard doesn't like that right now either. And so I think that was kind of just baked into like who the characters were.
Hi.
Hey.
So you talked about improv a little bit, but I was wondering just how you kind of write a script that inspires improv, like especially in comedy, and maybe like actors that wouldn't necessarily do improv otherwise.
I don't think about that much on the writer's end, because I'm still just trying to write the best script possible if they didn't improvise from it. That kind of question works more for like a director. A director will be able to, and again, it's helpful when the writer's on set with that, but like a director will look at the script and be like, maybe we have space here for having fun, and the showrunner will probably do that too. And so in terms of like actors who might not be that great at improv, you kind of just on set learn who likes it and who doesn't, and who you can trust to do it. And it's a skill. Not everyone can do it, and that's like totally okay. Which again is, I think that's why on the writer's end of it, you know, you're just trying to write it as best as you can, even assuming nobody can improvise.
Oh, me, pressure.
Hi.
Hey.
As you said, this is a show that inspires a lot of excitement, a lot of loyalty. What is the best way that we can support you as a writer? Set aside all our freaking out about trailer and season 2 and all that. Just how can we support you? Because we know this is going to be a tough time you're heading into next couple of months.
Oh, that's so sweet. There is an entertainment industry fund for like the lower level writers and folks in the industry who are affected like financially, if you have means for that. But truly, I think that the if you want to come down to like a picket line in LA, everyone is welcome, and you're gonna come, and Jay Leno will bring donuts, and Weezer will play apparently at Paramount, and but yeah, I mean the picket lines are a lot of fun, and everybody's welcome to come to that, or just like retweeting stuff about the strike, or asking questions. Pretty much any writer is pretty happy to talk about it, and now SAG too. Actors are authorizing a strike right now. They might strike as well. But it's a really nice question. Have fun watching the show. That means a lot to us too.
Well, thank you all so much. And it's so lovely to speak with a writer and not ChatGPT. So thank you so much for all
you're right.
of your labor. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you guys.